Shalom. All praises, blessings, glories, and honors to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Racha, Quadash. Double honors to my elder apostles and bishop elders of Great Millstone, who have taught me this truth, as well of men of like mind. Shalom wa chasad, which means peace and mercy, to the elect of the nation of Israel, whom are you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native American Indians, and Israelite foreigners of the seed line of our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whom are scattered here in America, which is Babylon the Great, and abroad. To you I say Shalom, and Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Ratazah. This lesson is edifying and informative. Ezekiel chapter 7 verse 19. They shall cast their silver in the streets, and their gold shall be removed. Their silver and their gold shall not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord Yahweh. They shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels, because it is the stumbling block of their iniquity. Verse 25. Destruction cometh, and they shall seek peace, and there shall be none. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 26. Mischief shall come upon mischief, and rumor shall be upon rumor. Then shall they seek a vision of the prophet, but the law shall perish from the priest, and counsel from the ancients. In the news, from the CNN Business, Larry Summers, a U.S. economy could hit an air pocket in the coming months. Consumers keep spending. That might not be good news for them or the Fed. And by the way, the Federal Reserve's chair, Jerome Powell, testifies today. So keep an eye on that. Now, let's read the first article, and Lord's willing, it is informative. The U.S. economy may still be running fast and strong. Why is that? Because consumers keep spending. When consumers keep spending, velocity, which is the flow of money within the economy, continues to flow. And this fuels inflation, which is what the Federal Reserve has been trying to slow down through creating a deflationary environment through the increasing of interest rates, which forces companies, corporations, businesses to cut down on their employees, which will then depreciate production, which will then depreciate velocity, thus slowing down the economy, and creating a deflationary environment. And what is inflation? Inflation is the general increase of goods and services due to the expansion of money supply within an economy. And so that is why, even though the U.S. economy may be running fast and strong, it still risks a sudden fall into a recession. But its risk, of suddenly falling into a recession still looms largely, despite the Federal Reserve's efforts. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers warned Monday, and they know what they're doing. Okay, they know exactly what they're doing. Summers told CNN's Poppy Harlow in an interview that he expects the Fed will have to raise its benchmark interest rate higher than expected, and that central banks push to combat inflation will soon trigger a downturn, right? Because when they increase interest rates too much, too aggressively, that causes the economy to eventually fall into a recession. The process of bringing down inflation will bring on a recession at some stage, as it almost always has in the past, Summers said. And for the U.S. economy, it could likely mean a Wile Coyote moment, Summers said, referencing the cartoon Keynes' relentless, yet futile pursuit of the speedy roadrunner off a cliff and into midair. That's a funny reference, because I used to watch that growing up, as well as you brothers and a few sisters I know. Gravity eventually could win out. So instead of reading on the rest of the article, which before I go to the video, it says the economy could hit an air pocket in a few months, he said. Now let's listen to this clip right here.
What's it like to hear from the people actually living the headlines? I'm Audie Cornish. My new CNN podcast talks to the people behind the trending stories. I've got a lot of questions.
The Assignment with Audie Cornish. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Friday's unusually strong jobs report showed that the United States added 517,000 jobs in January. Unemployment ticked down to 3.4%, the lowest since 1969. That came after the Federal Reserve once again hiked interest rates this week, but less aggressively than it has been doing in the past, reflecting a sense that inflation is cooling. Can the United States pull off a soft landing, bringing down inflation without triggering a recession? I'm joined by Larry Summers, Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, Director of National Economic Council under Barack Obama, and a former president of Harvard University. Welcome, Larry. So it seemed to me over the last few months that the people who felt a soft landing was likely had gotten very optimistic. You know, somebody like Paul Krugman was saying all the evidence is pointing in the direction that inflation has cooled. But in any advanced industrial economy, wage inflation is the most important thing. And does this tight job market get two vacancies for every person looking? Does this show that you still have a real inflation problem?
Fareed, you're asking the right question, and nobody can know the answer for sure. I've said often that soft landings are, as Samuel Johnson said of Second Marriage, the triumph of hope over experience. But from time to time, hope does triumph over experience. So it looks more possible that we'll have a soft landing than it did a few months ago. My continued fear.
Well, this was the same sentiment when inflation had just began running rampant. The Fed's sentiment was that inflation was transitory, meaning temporary. And fast forward to today, inflation is still out of whack and running rampant. And the velocity hasn't shown any sign of slowing down, which again, velocity is the flow of money within an economy. And velocity is used to measure a country's GDP. If velocity is high, then the GDP will reflect that. However, if it is low, then the GDP will be in the negatives or close to zero or 0.1 or whatever. Okay, now let's listen on.
Though, is exactly the one that you described, that we had a set of inflation indicators during 2022 that were very strong, that have now come back to earth, but they're still too high. They're still unimaginably high from the perspective of 2 or 3 years ago, and that getting the rest of the way back to target inflation may still prove to be quite difficult. So I'd say I'm encouraged, but it would be a big mistake to think that we were out of the woods.
So one of the things that people wonder is, suppose we end up in this situation with 3.5% inflation as the kind of norm rather than 2%, which is what most central banks target. Is it worth triggering a recession to get inflation down? How should we think about that trade-off between unemployment and inflation?
So I think the most important thing to recognize about that trade-off is that it's a trade-off between short-run reductions in unemployment and permanent changes in inflation. And so the benefit we can get from pushing unemployment low is, on almost all economic theories, likely not to be a permanent one. But if we push inflation up and those inflation expectations become entrenched, we're going to live with that inflation for a long time.
One of the reasons the labor market is so tight, it's difficult to find workers in America, is about 3 million people have kind of stopped looking for work. And we're not quite sure why. And I wondered if you had any theories. I heard I think it was a Times podcast where they interviewed a lot of these people, and it sounded like what they were, essentially Americans were moving toward a somewhat European attitude towards jobs. They were saying, look, these jobs were not very good. We worked very hard, and we've moved back to our home, which is lower cost. We've got a couple of gig jobs in the gig economy. We're making 60 or 70% of what we were making, but that's fine. Is it your sense that there is some change in the way that Americans are approaching work?
So I think, Fareed, if you look at that 3 million people, a lot of it is older people who stopped working during COVID and decided to retire earlier than normal patterns would suggest. So I think that's the largest part of it. Beyond that, I think there's definitely a kind of grand reassessment going on after COVID about how hard people want to work and how much they want to work and how much they want to be part of hierarchies. You don't get to be a CEO if you don't love being in the office. And so CEOs want all their people to...
Okay, so the point was already made and understood. So now let's move on to the next article. Consumers keep spending. That might not be good news for them or the Fed. And the first article summarized why. But let's briefly read and then listen as well, Lord's willing. U.S. consumers kept spending last year despite historically high inflation, not only shelling out for necessities but also splurging on restaurants, travel, and other experiences impeded by the pandemic. Economists had predicted spending would peter out as the months drew on, as savings diminished, high prices persisted, and I will add that credit card debt skyrocketed as well. And the Federal Reserve ratcheted up efforts to squeeze demand. And by November and December, they ratcheted up efforts to squeeze demand by increasing interest rates, because businesses, corporations usually make their money through borrowing money, and then they keep the spread in between, and then they pay back their bonds, their debt. But right now it's expensive to borrow money. It says those predictions appear to be materializing, and by November, December, those predictions appeared to be materializing when data showed consumers had pulled back during the holiday shopping season. Then came January, during a month chock full of surprisingly strong economic data. The Commerce Department's retail sales and consumer spending reports far surpassed expectations. It appears that consumers weren't just resilient or they were practically resurgent. If they have money, they've shown us they're going to spend it, said Shannon Sherry, Vice President and economist for Wells Fargo Corporate and Investment Bank. I think what's really going to take the consumer to turn would be a deterioration in the labor market. But like most things during these wonky economic times, the apparent January spending jump isn't as simple as it seems. Now let's take a listen to this video.
Welcome to Who's Talking. We have two things in common, and I bet you don't know either one of them.
Do I get a hint? I don't think I chose the universe. I think the universe chose me.
Who's Talking to Chris Wallace, Sunday nights at 7 on CNN.
I'm going to give you $1,000. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to go and spend it? Are you going to go and invest it? And if you do, what would you invest it in? Or are you going to take you and your friends out for a nice dinner?
Well, it's better to save it and invest it rather than consuming it, given that debt ratios are high. When inflation is rising, like last year, you lose money on equities because the discount factor for equities, that the bond yield goes higher, but the higher bond yield implies that the price of the bond is lower. So last year you lost more money on 10-year treasury, 20% price fall as the yield went from 1 to 3.5, than you did on the S&P 500, where you lost only 15%. So you lost money on your bonds, you lost money on your equity. If I'm right that the average inflation rate is not going to be 2%, it's going to be 6%, the loss that you saw last year on bonds and equity is going to be more severe in the next few years to come. How do you hedge yourself? Short-term bonds, inflation index bonds, commodities and precious metals like gold, and sustainable forms of real estate that do well when inflation is rising. So you have to move away from traditional investments like bonds and equity towards stuff that gets you a hedge against inflation, the basement of fiat currency, socio-political and geopolitical risk, and even environmental risks.
Will there be enough left over for an ice cream?
Yes, you can have an ice cream, but
Okay, so this video was really irrelevant to the title of this article. So what I'll do is I'll keep reading on just briefly before I move on to the next lesson. Siri and others cautioned that the early 2023 surge may be attributable, to seasonality quirks, or even more likely a temporary recovery to belt tightening at the tail end of last year. If anything, they say strong spending activity is likely on borrowed time as safety nets are fraying and negative external factors are accumulating. I think it's more likely that we'll see a return to some weaker data, some softer spending, some softer demand, because it's hard to see that resulting in a full turnaround. Given how much savings have already been worn down and credit utilization has climbed up, even as I mentioned earlier, said Kayla Brunn, economic analyst at decision intelligence company Morning Consult. It's not sustainable to keep spending above their means, right? People tend to hang their hat where their hands cannot reach. Eyes on the Fed, it says healthy consumer spending at a time like this is a double-edged sword, said Ted Roseman, senior industry analyst for bank rate and creditcards.com. The restlessness of consumer spending is probably the biggest thing that's pushing this recession timetable out, Russman said. In some respects, this is actually good for the economy because people are spending. Well, actually, it's not as bad. But what we worry about at the household level is, are they going to spend too much and get into trouble? No shit, Sherlock. While day-to-day expenses and the sheer influence of inflation are driving a lot of these numbers, this discretionary spending is also staying steady to some extent, he said. Higher prices are juicing some of these stats, he told CNN. Then again, there is a lot of demand. The job market is strong. I feel like consumer spending has been more robust than a lot of us predicted. And if this were to continue, it would certainly affect the game plan for the Fed, which has recently issued more modest rate hikes to assess the impact of its previous string of heavier-handed increases. 6 months ago, I would have said that, yes, if consumers continue to spend, the Fed is going to have to go higher. They're going to have to stay there longer, and they're going to cause a more severe recession. Wells Fargo CRE said. Part of me is thinking that is still potentially the case, but in some ways, this also makes the Fed's job a bit easier if consumers are able to withstand the higher rates and the labor market, doesn't deteriorate as much. She added the Fed might not necessarily have to go higher than currently projected, but they probably are going to be on hold for longer. So I will conclude reading the article there, as obviously, as you can see, it's a very lengthy one. So what I'll do is I'll leave the rest in the description box of this lesson, Lord is willing. Now let's move on to the AP. But, before I do that, let's read Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 19, because the time will come when people will begin to cast their money in the streets because it will become worthless. For a time, people will use gold and silver, but even that too will come to an end because everything will be utilized through the MOTB. Okay? It says, they shall cast their silver in the streets, and their gold shall be removed. Their silver and their gold shall not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord Yahweh. Right, so all the money that people will be saving up or have saved up, or whatever the rich has, it will not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord Yahweh, because our Lord is coming back like a thief in the night. Okay, and he's coming back with a sword, one to render his anger with fury and his rebuke with flames of fire. It says, for by fire and by his sword, as it is written, will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many. Okay, written in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 15 on down. It says, they shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels, because it is the stumbling block of their iniquity. So now let's move on to the AP. Briefly, Chinese minister warns China, U.S. on course for conflict. One headline. Another, Kim's sister warns North Korea ready to act against U.S. South Korea. The weak is boasting of itself, saying that it is strong. Beijing. Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Zhang warned Tuesday that Beijing and Washington are headed for conflict and confrontation if the U.S. doesn't change course, striking a combative tone at a moment when relations between the rivals are at a historic low. In his first news conference since taking office late last year, Qin's harsh language appeared to defy predictions that China might abandon its aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy in favor of more moderate rhetoric as the two countries face off over trade and technology, Taiwan human rights, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Washington's China policy has entirely deviated from the relations and soundtrack, Quinn told journalists on the sidelines of the annual meeting of China's rubber stamp legislature. When leaders lay out their economic and political priorities for the coming year, if the United States does not hit the brake, continues to speed down the wrong path, no amount of guardrails can prevent derailing, and there surely will be conflict and confrontation, said Quinn, whose new position is junior to the Communist Party's senior foreign policy official, Wang Yi. Such competition is a reckless gamble, with the stakes being the fundamental interests of the two peoples and even the future of humanity. Quinn's comments echoed remarks made by leader Xi Jinping in a speech Monday to legislatures. Western countries led by the United States have implemented all-around containment, blockade, and suppression of China, which has brought unprecedented grave challenges to our nation's development, Xi was quoted as saying by the official Xinhua news agency. In the face of that, China must remain calm, maintain concentration, strive for progress, while maintaining stability, take active actions, unite as one, and dare to fight, he said. U.S. officials have grown increasingly worried about China's expansive political and economic goals and the possibility of war over Taiwan, and many officials in Washington have called for the U.S. to make a bigger effort to counter Chinese influence abroad. I will conclude reading the article here as it is a lengthy one. So now let's move on to the final article. Oh, by the way, Senate will grow power over Fed efforts to tame inflation. Keep an eye on that for today. He testifies today. It says, CEO South Korea AP. The influential sister of North Korea's leader warned Tuesday that her country is ready to take quick, overwhelming action against the United States and South Korea, a day after the U.S. flew a nuclear-capable B-52 bomber in a demonstration of strength against the North. The U.S.-South Korean training on Monday involving the B-52 bomber over the Korean peninsula was the latest in a series of drills between the Allies in recent months. Their militaries are also preparing to revive their largest field exercises later this month. Kim Yo-jong didn't describe any planned actions in her statement, but North Korea has often launched missiles in response to U.S.-South Korean military drills because it views them as an invasion rehearsal. We keep our eye on the restless military moves by the U.S. forces in South Korea in puppet military and are always on the standby to take appropriate, quick, and overwhelming action at any time according to our judgment, Kim Yo-jong said in the statement carried by state media. The demonstrative military moves and all sorts of rhetoric by the U.S. and South Korea, which goes so extremely frantic as not to be overlooked, undoubtedly provide North Korea with conditions for being forced to do something to cope with them, she said. Hours after Kim's statement, the General Staff of North Korean People's Army said it put its frontline artillery units on alert and heightened surveillance activities after it detected a live fire artillery drill by the enemy in the South Korean border town of Paju on Tuesday morning. General Saf said about 30 rounds were fired during the South Korean exercise, which is described as a very grave military provocation that aggravated tensions, and urged its rival to immediately stop such activities near the border. I will conclude reading the article here. I will leave the rest in the description box of the lesson, and I will now conclude reading again Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 25. Destruction cometh, and they shall seek peace, and there shall be none. So in the time of destruction, people will attempt to seek peace, even 2/3 which say that the evil shall not overtake nor prevent them, according to the book of Amos chapter 9, verse 10. And when they're going to be promised peace and safety, according to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3, that's when destruction which cometh will come suddenly upon them, and they shall not escape. Okay? And they shall not escape. It says, And they shall seek peace, and there shall be none. So there's not going to be any peace during the times in the presence of destruction. Mischief shall come upon mischief, and rumor shall be upon rumor. Then shall they seek a vision of the prophet. That's when they're going to want answers. Oh, we got to find those guys that used to be in the street corners, that used to be in the internet. We got to find those, man. We got to, find them to get the answers. Why is all this stuff happening? Oh, we should have listened, man. Damn, we should have listened, man. Crying and shit, gnashing their teeth in despair and regret. Then shall they seek a vision of the prophet, but the law shall perish from the priest. So they won't be able to find the true men of the Lord. And all these other false leaders of our people, which cause them to err, and they that are led of them will be destroyed, as it is written. Guys like Creflo Dollar, I like to call him Creflo, give me your dollar. That goddamn extorting demon. TD Fakes, Farrakhan, Al Sharpton, all these people, Joel Osteen, Joyce Myers, and all these, Edomites, and all these different false leaders, prophets, priests. They're going to perish right along with them. But the law shall perish from the priests and counsel from the ancients. Because during those evils, which the word evil means bad time, evil means time, and ill means bad, the Lord is going to hide wit, as it is written in the book of Amos. Okay? He's going to hide his knowledge. He's going to hide his prophets. So, with that, I pray this lesson was edifying and informative to the elect. Until the next, I say Shalom. Yahweh Ba'ashem, Yahweh Shai Ba'ashem, Bracha Kodash, Brakatham to the elect. Until the next, Shalom.